You're live now.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening and welcome. Welcome to this very special evening and this very significant talk that's going to be given to us this evening by Professor Melanie O'Brien from the University of Western Australia, currently at the University of Minnesota in the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. My job here is to be the MC and to moderate the questions. I'll be turning things over to other people to do other things shortly. But before we get started, I did have a few thank yous I needed to pass on, because any event like this, of course, requires collaboration and the goodwill of different departments, organizations, and groups. And in my particular case, I wanted to thank the Peace and Conflict Studies program at the University of Manitoba. I'm the director of that program. I'd also like to thank the Department of Sociology and the Masters of Human Rights program, all of which have contributed to the success of this visit. I'd also in particular like to thank the Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada and its director, Dr. Kauser Ahmed, for collaborating with us specifically on this evening's event, which I don't think would have been possible without his significant efforts. It's an important topic that is going to be addressed this evening. I'll have more to say about the format for the Q&A when that moment arrives in the evening, but for right now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ahmed to get the event properly underway. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you very much, Dr. Adam. My name is Kauser Ahmed, and before I begin, let me do the treaty recognition. Conflict and Resilience Research Institute and those who have all gathered here today, we all are located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homelands of Métis Nation. We all are working together in the true spirit of reconciliation. The audience, it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Melanie O'Brien today to Winnipeg. I know that she has arrived already. She's a day old, 24 hours old in Winnipeg, but nonetheless, formal welcome on behalf of the Institute. Melanie, we are so pleased to have you with us. And I just wanted to also share a couple of thoughts this evening. Especially, I want to acknowledge Dr. Adam Muller, who actually initiated this idea to host this show today. And I often interact with Dr. Adam and Peace and Conflict Studies and More Institute. I am an alumni there. So I do have a very much working relationship with the Institute, and we would like to do more events in the future. Today, as Dr. Adam mentioned, it's really important that we look back at the convention, Genocide Convention, which is coming to 75th year next week. And it is so critical today that we do also ask ourselves what we have done so far with regards to the idea of genocide prevention. And I'm sure the scholars, keynote speaker and Adam Muller, and we do have Andrew Woolford today from University of Manitoba, and they would be more, in terms of delivering their ideas with regards to genocide prevention. But I'm personally involved with Rohingya genocide studies and my country, place of birth, Bangladesh genocide. So I am involved with these studies for some time, and it always really gives me some bit of, I would say, intriguing question with regards to the convention itself. When I read these conventions, the first article or first clause is about it says that if you accept that in Article 2, the conditions, 5 conditions for which some cases might be termed as genocide, then according to Article 1, you should all work together to prevent it and stop it and punish the perpetrators. And that is always, for me, a very hopeful message. But I'm sure you all agree with me this evening that after 1948, we have been facing numerous genocides, and we have witnessed those things. And possibly we can claim that we have done enough to prevent future genocide as well. And the last point I think I would like to share that we often use this term quite, I would say, loosely without understanding the gravity of the term itself. There are many ways to explain the mass atrocity, the crimes against humanity and war crime. And particularly, I remember when I was listening the argument in Hague when Aung San Suu Kyi and her legal team was arguing that the cases of atrocities in Myanmar, actually it is war crime, not genocide. And this is what I just wanted to share this evening with you, that I'm sure keynote speaker and during the Q&A session, you will be having more ideas how to use this term properly so that it carries the weight of the punishment, of stopping it so that it doesn't happen in the future. So I think with these thoughts, I would now welcome the director of the Human Rights Program, Dr. Michelle, to introduce the keynote speaker and carry on with the rest of the events. Thank you. Welcome, Michelle.
So good evening, everyone. Thank you for those remarks, Kauser, very much. I think the Genocide Convention, in many ways, as Kauser was noting, has this really heavy normative weight, which is one of the reasons why the term genocide is sometimes used loosely, as you said, and it becomes a powerful tool for advocacy, but also there's some importance, I think, in ensuring that it's used the right way. So I'm very pleased this evening to introduce Dr. Melanie O'Brien. Dr. O'Brien, or Mel as I know her personally, is both a longtime friend and a respected colleague. She's an associate professor of international law at the University of Western Australia. Her work on forced marriage has been cited by the International Criminal Court as well as by other scholars. And I think I know you're maybe not talking, or I'm guessing you're not talking so much about this work this evening, but it's also quite interesting because it's really part of a concerted effort, I think, to ensure that this kind of gendered analysis is incorporated into the way that we understand international crimes, which also relates, of course, to the Genocide Convention. She's also the president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, and a few of us I know are members of the association and have been to the meetings. She's the author of many articles as well as 2 books. These are Criminalizing Peacekeepers, Modernizing National Approaches to Sexual Exploitation and Abuse. And her most recent book, which I handily have right here, From Discrimination to Death, Genocide Process Through a Human Rights Lens. And Dr. O'Brien also presented yesterday on this book at the University of Manitoba. So yeah, I can say certainly that it's an original contribution, a substantial contribution to the way that we understand genocide and the crime of genocide. So today she'll be reflecting on the Genocide Convention after 75 years. And in many ways, the convention is kind of the Bible for those of us who study genocide, as well as those of us who work on genocide prevention and advocacy issues. But the convention in some ways is also a product of its time. The exclusion of the direct mention of sexual violence, for example, although we certainly know this has been read into the convention. The shaping of the definition of genocide by Western powers that essentially weren't very interested in having any light shed on colonial violence. And there are many jurisprudential efforts and advocacy efforts that are striving to kind of bring the convention into the 21st century. And usually this doesn't entail actually rewriting the convention, but changing the way that we understand the convention and the way that we apply the convention. And these tensions have played out, of course, in courts. They've played out in public discourse. They've played out right in this museum, I know as well. And Dr. O'Brien will touch on many of these issues in her talk, so I'm not going to say anything more about that. But I hope you will join me in welcoming Dr. Melanie O'Brien.
Excuse me, could be the mic and we could
Can you hear me? No, that's, is it on?
Mic's not on, Carl.
Oh, there's a light. That might be on now.
That will
There we
help
go.
the online people
Yeah, it
very
wasn't on.
much.
How's that? Can you hear me? Yeah, that's better? Okay, great. Want to make sure everyone can hear. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for the warm welcome that I've had here in Winnipeg. It's not my first time in Canada, but it's my first time in Winnipeg, and I've been wanting to come here for a long time. So I'm really happy to be able to finally visit here and to finally visit this wonderful museum, which I got a tour of today. I would like to thank the 3 departments or centres from the University of Manitoba for hosting me here. As Adam has listed, Sociology, Peace and Conflict Studies, and the Human Rights Program, and the CRRIC for bringing me here and hosting me. So tonight I'm going to, I am a lawyer, so just a heads up there. So I'm going to talk to you about the law, but I hope in a way that everyone here who isn't a lawyer will be able to understand. And if you have any questions of something that wasn't clear in the Q&A, please feel free to ask me. And I'm going to be talking about a treaty. It's a law. So the structure of the talk is I'm going to give you a bit of a background to the convention, and then I'm going to talk about a few examples of genocides that have taken place since the convention came into place. But also after that, what I'm going to talk to you about is how the law, international law, was used for punishment of perpetrators of those genocides, and for to hold countries accountable as well. And I want to finish on a positive note as well, to tell you about how the Genocide Convention is being used these days. I want to do a bit of a triple land acknowledgement today because we are obviously on the lands of Indigenous people here. In Winnipeg, we are on Treaty 1 lands, and I want to acknowledge that where we meet today, the homeland of the Red River Metsi, and also acknowledging, importantly, that the water in the museum here comes from Shoal Lake, and we're grateful to the First Nations who take care of that and provide that for us. But I also want to do a couple of other acknowledgements that may not be the land we are on today, but that are relevant to me. I'm currently a visiting professor at the University of Minnesota, and so that land that I am working on normally at the moment is Minnesota Makoche, and that's the homelands of the Dakota Oyate people, Indigenous people. However, normally I am based on Whadjuk Noongar country, which is in Perth, Western Australia. And I always want to acknowledge that that's where I'm based and I do my work and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging there. Okay, so where did the Genocide Convention come from? It came from a Polish jurist called Raphael Lemkin. And Raphael Lemkin was a witness by distance to the Armenian genocide. He read about it, he saw it in the news. He was then personally affected by the Holocaust as well. And thinking about both of these genocides and having studied law, he started thinking, why is it that one person can be held accountable for killing one person, but one person can't be held accountable for killing thousands or even millions of people? And he started thinking about this and said, why don't we have a crime? Why isn't this a crime? And so he started working on this over time, and he wrote about it, this idea, and he did some scribbles because he was trying to come up with a word for it. And this is a picture of the scribbles that he did while he was thinking about what could be the word that we could use to describe this destruction of a people. And that's how he came up with the word genocide. And he put together two terms from Greek to mean essentially, the destruction, the death of a race or a tribe. And you can see, I love this because it just shows someone brainstorming and thinking about it. And he actually came up with something that's so important and so many years later has so much relevance for so many people. So this was after the Holocaust. And in this short period of time, we're thinking about this 1945 to 1948 period, he was trying to get the crime of genocide as one of the crimes in the post-World War II trials. He had very limited success there because, of course, it was a new concept. And we lawyers, we don't like to have new concepts. We don't like to prosecute people for things that didn't exist at the time. It's one of the fundamental principles of criminal law. We call it nullum crimen sine lege, which means no crime without a law. However, what he then did was he went to New York and he lobbied states, he lobbied the countries of the UN, and he said, we need to have a convention on this concept, on this word that I've coined, this word genocide. And that's how the Genocide Convention came about, because of the work of this one amazing man, who interestingly ended up at the end of his life essentially destitute and, had quite, even though he honestly contributed so much to the world, had quite a sad ending to his life. He's buried in Queens, Brooklyn, anyway, New York area. So this is an image of the Genocide Convention from 1948 that Lemkin helped create. The definition that went in, which I'm going to talk to you about in a second, was not the definition that Lemkin had created in his book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, but it was a compromise. And that's what happens with all treaties. You've got a lot of countries coming together to negotiate a written form of law, and they all have different ideas, they all have different agendas, and so everyone compromises. And that was what happened with the outcome of the definition of genocide. And the interesting thing is that it hasn't changed since then. No one's even talked about changing it since then. Even when they were discussing the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, they didn't change the definition of genocide. So that's what we're stuck with at the moment. So what is the genocide definition in the convention? So I want to show you the definition first, and then I'm going to show you a few little provisions just to show you what the convention itself does. So Article 2 is where we find the definition of genocide, which is the destruction in whole or in part of a particular group. And there are only 4 categories of groups that are included here. So national, ethnical, racial, and religious. So you notice, for example, that political groups are not included. And remember I mentioned many countries coming together, many different agendas. Think about that time. Stalin was there. Stalin was in charge of the Soviet Union. So of course, they certainly didn't want to have political groups in there. So that's the type of thing that influences what goes into the text of an international treaty. So that's why we have those 4 groups today. Those 4 groups are also seen as, something that isn't necessarily changeable, whereas politics is. And so it's an inherent characteristic of the group. The 5 crimes that you see there are the 5 crimes that can be committed within the crimes of genocide. But they all have to be committed with this intent to destroy. So the intent to destroy is the specific challenge of genocide and is the most difficult thing to prove in a court of law. We call it, the Latin term is dolus specialis, which means special intent. So it's more than the normal mens rea, or the mental intent that you have to have when you commit a crime. So you have to intend to commit the crime. So for example, forcibly transferring children or killing members of the group, but you also have to do that with the intent to destroy in whole or in part that group that that person belongs to. Article 3 talks about the particular sort of formats that shall be punishable by the countries that ratify this convention. So genocide itself, but they also look at other things. So things like conspiracy, attempt, complicity, and importantly, incitement to commit genocide. So that's where leaders, where people in the media call out for people to participate in violence and to persecute and attack that minority group. So that's quite an important one that they included, and has certainly been a crime that has been prosecuted, for example, from the genocide in Rwanda in the 1990s. So that's the definition of genocide. Just to give you a little bit of idea of what else is in there, like what does this treaty actually do? This is the international law word for countries. So when we say state, we mean country. So if you hear me use states instead of country, then you know that's what I'm talking about. So here is where the state parties, so those countries that have ratified this convention, agree that genocide is a crime under international law, and they undertake to prevent and punish that. So that's their main obligations under this treaty. Article 5 is essentially one of the ways that they can do that, but they are obligated to do that. So Article 5 is where it says that the state parties actually have to enact domestic law to make sure that they have law so they can punish people who commit genocide. So it's interesting, and I don't have the stats off the top of my head, but it's interesting to see how many countries that have ratified this convention but actually don't have genocide in their national laws. So this is something that I want to work on, and that I think needs to be worked on, for example, by the UN, is to encourage countries that are a party to this to actually comply with their obligations, including these ones, so thinking about putting genocide into their domestic law. Article 6, and this is important to what I'm going to talk about today, talks about that persons who are charged with genocide shall be tried, but either by domestic or international courts. So today I'm going to talk to you of some examples of international courts and how they have held people and countries accountable. And so therefore, it's actually the implementation of this convention at work. Article 8 says that state parties they may, so they're not obligated to, but they may call upon UN organs to take action to prevent and suppress acts of genocide. I think this is underused, and I think that this is something that more countries need to be doing in terms of their obligations, is taking action on acts of genocide. Article 9, this is also relevant to what I'm going to be talking about in a bit, but Article 9 says that disputes over the Genocide Convention shall be submitted to the International Court of Justice. So the International Court of Justice is a court that oversees and adjudicates disputes between states. So it's not about individual accountability, but it's about what we call state accountability. So for example, you may have two countries that are party to a treaty, and one country says, well, this other party has violated its obligations that it should be carrying out under that convention. And I'm going to talk about a bit later how that is being used at the moment, which is what I think is positive use of the Genocide Convention lately. So I want to talk about 3 examples of genocides that have taken place since the Genocide Convention came into place. From the 1970s, the 1990s, and in recent time, well, essentially current times. And then I'm going to talk about how courts have held people accountable for these. These are by no means all of the genocides that have been committed since 1948, but we certainly cannot cover those here tonight, so I'm using these as examples. The first one is the Cambodian genocide, which happened in the late 1970s, and that was under you've probably heard of the Khmer Rouge regime that was in charge then. And that particular genocide consisted of some very typical steps that we normally see as part of genocide, and also some more unusual ones. One of the typical things that we saw there was extensive forced labor. People were made to work in the rice fields. People were made to work very manual labor. This is often what we see happens in genocide, very hard labor, manual labor. So doing things like building dams, building roads, because the Khmer Rouge wanted to create this empire that channeled the Khmer, the Angkor. If you think about Angkor Wat, these beautiful temples, they were channeling that kind of era of Cambodian greatness. And so they wanted to build all these great things, and that's what they did. They took people out of the cities because they didn't like what they called city people or new people. They thought that you were only good if you were a rural person or an old person. And so they thought that anyone who worked in cities was bad, and they emptied out the cities and they took everyone into the rural areas and put them into forced labor. And you can see just this is what it looked like. There's not a lot of photos from the time because it was the late 70s and they didn't take a lot of photos, but we do have some, so we know that it was mass forced labor where people were working in the rice fields or, as I said, building things like dams and roads. One of the results of forced labor is death. So this is one of the ways that perpetrators actually carry out the physical extermination of the group, because they work people to death. And they are usually doing that at the same time as they are starving them to death. So the work becomes more and more difficult as they go through. So I mentioned that people were working in the rice fields, but they didn't really get to eat much of that. So the rice in Cambodia, the majority of it was put into great warehouses, and it was either exported to places like China or it was left to rot while the people were left to starve. One of the unusual aspects of the Cambodian genocide was forced marriage. And I've done quite a bit of work on forced marriage in different contexts, but it was quite different from other situations in Cambodia. When we talk about forced marriage, normally it's usually a girl or a woman who has been forced into marriage. But in Cambodia, it was both. It was the male and the female were forced to marry each other by a third party. And so people were forced to marry someone they didn't know, which was really traumatic for them. And there was no ceremony, no traditional Buddhist ceremony. Instead, as you see in the picture, and this is one of the photos that was used in the courts, which I'll talk about in a bit as evidence, they would have men on one side and women on the other, and they would have a mass ceremony where attendees would have to pledge allegiance to the Khmer Rouge, and that was the wedding ceremony. So that was quite distressing for people in many ways, including the fact that they were not married to someone that they wanted to be married to, but also the fact that they were not married in a traditional Buddhist ceremony. After they were married, people were forced to consummate that marriage. And they were put into houses, and someone would be stationed under the house. Cambodian houses are built on stilts, or outside the house to listen, to monitor them, to make sure that they were consummating that marriage. So it's quite an interesting situation because it also brings up the issue of rape, and rape of both sides, forcing a man to rape a woman, but he didn't want to do it. So there's this issue of consent from both parties there. There was also an extensive system of torture and killing. Many people will have heard of the killing fields of Cambodia. There's a book and a movie of that title, and they were all over Cambodia. And you can visit them when you go to Cambodia, and there are literally fields and still with pieces of bone coming out of them. There was also an extensive torture prison system throughout the country. And on the slide here, I've got pictures of Tuol Sleng Museum, which was known as S21. And this is in the middle of Phnom Penh. And it was one of those torture prisons where they tortured people. And only a handful of people came out of this prison alive. And a couple of them were children, and then the other ones were artists who had managed to stay alive because of their artistry skill. They were painting paintings of Pol Pot and other leaders because that was what they were tasked with doing, and that saved their lives. So what we actually have are quite a lot of artworks that are used as testimony from Cambodia. And so I have a couple of pictures of those in a moment. So what artists did was afterwards they painted what they had witnessed as their form of testimony. So you can see here images of still barbed wire that remains and images of what were small cells where people were kept. And people were tortured quite horrifically and extensively there, and then they were taken and buried out in the killing fields, the Chungek killing fields, which are now on the outskirts of Phnom Penh. These are some of the artwork that people have painted. As I said, their way of witnessing, so not necessarily writing a testimony, but putting their testimony into art. You can see there's a painting of forced labor, people being whipped, tortured while they're doing forced labor. And the other picture is taken in Tuol Sleng. And if I go back, you can see the floor. Do you see the checkered floor, the tiled floor there? And you can see it in the painting as well that they drew. And that was the rooms they were kept in. And the image there, you can see they're actually being given a shower with a hose, but they were lucky if they had that happen once a week. So they were chained up at the ankles, all of them together in this room where they lived, and barely had any ability to wash themselves and stay clean. There were, of course, mass killings and mass deaths by starvation and forced labor. So there are many mass graves around the country of Cambodia. And as I said, you can actually visit the killing fields and see that they have exhumated some of the bones, a lot of bones at some of the sites, but the bones still remain there. And I visited one killing field in a more remote location, and people have rice fields there, and they work the rice fields in bare feet, and there are bones underneath their feet when they work the rice fields. So it's still part of their lives on an everyday basis. So this is an image taken at the time, but what they have done at some of the main ones, so Chungek, the main killing fields just outside of Phnom Penh, they have created memorials. So a stupa is the name of that building there, and that's a Cambodian memorial building essentially. And they've filled it with bones. So the image that you see on the left is taken inside that stupa. And so they have very interestingly separated the bones out by category, so skulls, tibia, etc., and ordered them within there. And one of the reasons is that there were so many people buried together that they couldn't actually have each individual's skeleton together. So that was their way of putting them in there and hopefully bringing peace to those people. So that's the Cambodian genocide and some of the aspects of it. I obviously can't cover everything for every genocide, but just trying to give you a bit of an idea of what happened in each one. So I want to jump 20 years ahead to the 1990s, to 1995, Srebrenica in Bosnia. And this took place in the context of the breakdown of the former Yugoslavia and the conflict that had been going on there. And this is an image taken, so I should add that unless otherwise noted, all of the photos are my own. It makes it easier as a lawyer, copyright, all that kind of thing. So this is an image of the former Dutch battalion headquarters. So they were a battalion, obviously, from the Netherlands that were part of the UN mission at the time. And this was their headquarters in the very small town of Potocari, which is right near Srebrenica. And essentially, this is where the genocide happened. So what happened was that, so where Srebrenica is, there are hills. Srebrenica, it's at the end. There's nowhere to go once you get there. So there's all these towns ahead. And the Bosnians had been fleeing this way and this way and this way until they couldn't get anywhere else. And so they ended up at Srebrenica and at Potocari, which is right next to it. And there were, groups of people living in apartments, and they all ended up fleeing to these headquarters. And you can see the fence is still there. So it looks like quite a large complex, but if you fill it with thousands of people, then it becomes very crowded. So they fled in there, and essentially what happened was Milosevic showed up with his soldiers, and the Dutch didn't really know what to do. They were a small battalion. They didn't have weapons. They were also on a UN mission. They weren't there to fight the Serbian military. And Milosevic assured them that nothing would happen to the people that he took out. And one of the women that I have met whose husband was murdered in the Srebrenica genocide told me while we were standing there, she said, he came and he said he wouldn't harm a hair on our head, but he didn't say anything about the head on our shoulders. And he came, and there's footage of this, and he gave out candy, sweets. And then he took the military-aged men and boys, and he took them, he put the women and the girls and the elderly onto buses, and they were bussed out. Some of the military-aged boys and men fled into the forests nearby and were recaptured. And those boys and men that he took were all murdered. Now, I did take this in 2019. I think it was, so the number may have gone up because every year they are finding more bodies. And initially it was estimated over 7,000 boys and men were killed, but now it's known it's over 8,000. This is the cemetery, the Srebrenica Potocari Memorial and Cemetery, and I could not capture it in one photograph because it is so huge. And they bury them all there. Every year on the anniversary in July, they have a ceremony and they bury any more remains of anyone that has been found in the past year. So they continue to add to this. But this is only the cemetery at Srebrenica Potocari. There are other cemeteries in the region. Remember I said there were those towns along the way, and so there are other ones such as Bratunac that also have cemeteries. They're smaller, but it gives you an idea of just how many boys and men were killed. And I mentioned that I was standing there with a woman who lost her husband, and this is her and her sister. And the woman who lost her husband, what they did with the graves, the mass graves that they buried the boys and men in, they moved them around because they got to a point where they said, they're onto us. They know what we did, so let's move the bodies. So they moved them around to different graves, and her husband's remains were found in multiple different graves. So she has at least been able to lay part of him to rest, but not all of him. Okay, I want to jump ahead now to today. And Khalsa has mentioned the Rohingya, and I want to talk about the Rohingya. They have dropped off the radar a little bit. And I do want to say that I have the date 2017 there, but this is still ongoing. So please don't think that it means that it finished in 2017. It's just that's the key recent date where there was a significant amount of physical violence. However, the Rohingya have been persecuted and discriminated against in Myanmar for decades, even though they have been living there for hundreds of years, and there is historical evidence to show that. They have been excluded. They are called Bengali by the government, which is used by them as a derogatory term. They have been targeted as a Muslim minority, and they have been targeted as an ethnic minority as well. They have been denied education, citizenship, healthcare, pretty much anything. They have been moved into camps. They have had their villages destroyed. You can see here, these are images, satellite images that I've taken from Human Rights Watch. These are from 2017. And they showed the destruction of the Rohingya villages. So these are just two, but there are images where you can see, as you see here, villages being burnt, but you can also see the aftermath. And you can clearly see the difference between an intact village and a village that has been completely burnt down. So these were burned by bombs being dropped on the villages or by soldiers setting fire to the villages. There was an extensive and horrific amount of rape as part of this genocide. Many girls and women were very brutally raped and often gang raped. The killings were extremely horrific as well. I spent time, my last trip before COVID, I was in Bosnia and Bangladesh doing interviews, and I interviewed women in the refugee camps in Bangladesh, and they all had videos on their phones of what they had witnessed. And I can tell you that those images, those videos are nothing you will see in the news, and they will never leave my head until the day I die. Just absolutely horrific. So a lot of this escalated in 2017. So there had been an escalation in 2012. This hadn't come out of the blue. But in 2017, it escalated again with extreme violence. It's estimated perhaps 10,000 people were killed. This is not known because the Myanmar, the Tatmadaw, the military, who are in charge, military dictatorship in Myanmar, won't let anyone in to do independent verification. So it's estimated that 10,000 people died, but it could be more. In about August 2017, pretty much within a month, 1 million people had fled across the border into Bangladesh. 1 million people. Can you fathom what that is like, that number? The refugee camps there already existed. There were some people already living in them, but they obviously swelled immediately in number. These are some images from the camps and what life is like for refugees who flee genocide. What I say is, can you imagine 1 million people suddenly being in one area? And despite all the goodwill of the international community and the hard work, you can't possibly provide for them. You can't possibly give them all food. You can't possibly give them all healthcare. You've got people arriving who are already ill. You've got women who are pregnant from rape. You've got people who have walked for days, for weeks, who have, injuries, cuts on their legs and their feet. You have people who are suffering from illnesses, who are suffering already from starvation because they haven't had access to food. And they're arriving in these camps and they immediately have no shelter, no food, and no healthcare. Over time, of course, the refugee camps have improved. You can see this one, the image here on the left, you can see it actually has drainage. They had to put drainage in because they were flooding, and the flooding was wiping away the shelters that they have. You can see that the shelters are made of bamboo and tarp, and that's it. So they had to start putting in drainage. There's also amazing stories about elephants. And I didn't put a picture in here of the elephant towers, but the camps are actually on a migration route for elephants. And so the elephants were stamping through over the shelters. But what they did, which I think is wonderful, instead of saying, we're going to kill the elephants or something, they said, well, this is their migration route. So they now have elephant towers, and they've made sure that area is wide open for the elephants. And they have the watchtowers so that when the elephants do come, they can set the alert so people get out of the way of the elephants. So I really like that because I think it shows, living in harmony with the environment that exists there. And this is a photograph of me with one of the refugees that I interviewed, and you can see inside the house, it's very, very basic. The only furniture they have is 1 or 2 plastic chairs, and they get gas tanks, and they have essentially a wooden board for a bed and a bench, and that's it. Sanitation is a huge problem. This is one of the camps that lower down, so it's a newer camp, so it's not as well equipped. It hasn't been there as long, and you can see they have dwellings, and next to them is where they have rubbish and where they have sewage and things like that right next to where they're living. The other image you can see are some toilets. So some areas of the camps do have toilets set up. In the ones at the top, which are the oldest, they actually have a flushing toilet, which is pretty amazing. But that's certainly not the case as you head further down to the newer ones that are less established. So it's a really challenging life for refugees of genocide, and that's something that I always want people to remember what it's like. And to me, the genocide doesn't finish when they cross a border, because they're crossing it and they're in unsafe conditions, unsanitary conditions, without access to food and healthcare. So I think that's part of the process that they're going through. So those are the three examples that I wanted to talk to you about. And now I want to show you how the Genocide Convention has been used in international law for accountability for these. So you can see that there is something that comes out of this, that the treaty is there for a reason. For Cambodia, they set up the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia. And this is a hybrid tribunal. It has half international and half Cambodian staff. So it's called, from the name, the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia. So it's not a separate international tribunal. It's actually part of their Cambodian system, but they also use international staff there. So they have a co-Cambodian prosecutor and a co-international prosecutor that work together. It's been a rocky road with that one because of the high levels of corruption in the Cambodian government and the pressure that the government has put on the Cambodian employees of the court. And so there's been a lot of turnover with the international prosecutors because some of them just ended up incredibly frustrated that they couldn't actually provide justice the way justice should be provided. And so it became a source of frustration. So they have had very few cases, in fact, that have gone through there. But for the purposes of the talk tonight, I want to say that they have convicted perpetrators of genocide in that court, which is a really positive thing. The only thing is that they convicted the perpetrators for committing genocide against minority populations in Cambodia. So the Muslim, Cham, Vietnamese and Chinese minorities, but they didn't convict them of committing genocide against the Khmer people. And I think that's an incredibly disappointing lack of progress from that court. And that's something that, the prosecutor thought that, the prosecutor argued, but, it just didn't go anywhere. And then I believe it was, and I talk about that in my book, to plug that for a second. But I do believe it was, and I do believe they should have really made that concerted argument and that the court should have found for that. However, at least it is positive that they did make convictions for that and for the persecution and the genocide of those minority groups that were also targeted during that time. For Srebrenica, we're looking at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Now, this was set up in the 90s. It started at the time the conflict was ongoing. So it has been very busy and it has had many trials and it has convicted many perpetrators of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and of genocide. So it has convicted people for the genocide committed in Srebrenica, and is an important contribution to the narrative and the experiences of what happened during not only the conflict, but during the Srebrenica genocide. So those are really key findings. And the jurisprudence that comes out of this court is really important because, if you think back at that definition of genocide, it's pretty limited. And, that's what we do when we write down a law. We have to keep it simple. And it's the courts that really explore and expand and develop the definition of that. And so we saw that happen in the case law, particularly of the ICTY. So we're talking about, the big leaders that were there at the time. Obviously, Milosevic unfortunately died before his trial could be completed, but I have no doubt that he would have been convicted of that. But Mladic as well, General Mladic, who was there at the time on the ground and took away those boys and men from the Dutch Bat compound and killed them. I do want to recommend, while I think about it, there's a film, can you remember the name of it? Quo Vadis Ada, which is about Srebrenica, and it's a really excellent film and portrays really, really well. It's set just on the one day that it happened, which you think might be a bit strange to have a film just set on one day, but it's very powerful and a really quite accurate depiction, even though the story itself and the character is not true. But what it's based on and the way they portray it is very, very well done. So if you want to learn, a bit more about what happened at the time, I encourage you to watch that film. Okay, so we also have the Permanent International Criminal Court. Now, the International Criminal Court came into being in July 2002, and it does have its limitations. So it can, even though it's permanent, it's only allowed to prosecute crimes that were committed since it started on the 1st of July 2002. So it can't deal with any historical crimes. So no historical genocides, no historical conflicts before that date. So that's a bit of a limitation, but it's also saying, well, it doesn't have retroactivity. So again, one of the fundamental principles of criminal law. So unfortunately, it can't be used, for example, when, that's why we set up something like the Cambodia Tribunal and the Yugoslavia Tribunal. So they're ad hoc and they're limited to that particular situation, and that's where their jurisdiction lies. But the ICC now has jurisdiction over crimes that are committed. So it was established by a treaty called the Rome Statute. And like any treaty in international law, only the countries that ratify that treaty are bound by that treaty. So the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over nationals of its state parties and crimes committed within the territory of its state parties. So we're in Canada, which is a state party. So anyone who is Canadian who commits a crime in Canada or outside of Canada, that is an international crime, could potentially be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. Hopefully that wouldn't happen, because hopefully Canada would fulfill its obligations and prosecute that person instead. And that's the idea behind this court. The idea is that it's a court of last resort. And so the idea is that what we have is a system, an international criminal justice system. And the states that ratify the Rome Statute, that become a party to the International Criminal Court, enact their own laws, and if there are perpetrators within their country, that they prosecute them. When the ICC steps in is when a country is unwilling or unable to do so, to investigate or to prosecute. So often, quite frankly, it's unwilling. But it can also be unable. When you think about a country that has been through mass atrocities, that has been through armed conflict, that country is in turmoil. The law and order system, the law enforcement system has usually completely collapsed. So it just doesn't have the capacity to undertake mass trials, or it could take years before they could set up a system where they could do that. So that's when the International Criminal Court can step in. So where does that leave the court at the moment in thinking about the examples that I was talking about? Well, the Rohingya. Now, it may not surprise you to hear that Myanmar is not a party to the International Criminal Court. So you may then think, well, how would the International Criminal Court possibly have jurisdiction over crimes committed in Myanmar by Burmese people? Well, some really creative lawyering. As I mentioned, in August 2017, 1 million Rohingya fled across the border into Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a state party to the International Criminal Court. So what happened is the prosecutor went to the court and said, look, I want to ask you whether we have jurisdiction. Can we have jurisdiction? And what she did, the prosecutor at the time, Fatou Bensouda, was she said, I want to focus on the crime against humanity of deportation, because deportation, by definition, involves crossing a border. So the crime begins in one country and is completed in another country. This is actually not an unusual concept in criminal law. And especially now we have globalization, there's a lot of transnational crime, there's many crimes that are committed across borders. And, Canada has a border with the United States. I'm sure you've read many news stories where there are crimes that cross those borders. But it's unusual to see it happen in international criminal law. So this was really exciting development for lawyers. So forgive me for getting excited about these legal intricacies. So she made that argument to the court and said, will you give me permission to investigate? And the court said yes. So the court gave the prosecutor permission to investigate on the basis of Bangladesh's jurisdiction. So not saying that Bangladesh or anyone in Bangladesh is a perpetrator or liable, but saying that the crime committed in Myanmar was completed on the territory of Bangladesh, and therefore they can investigate that. Interestingly, the court also said that they could investigate any other crime within the jurisdiction of the court as long as it took place in the territory of Bangladesh or any other state party. So at the moment, the prosecutor is investigating the crimes that were committed against the Rohingya. So that's really exciting. My only comment is that it's kind of going to the wayside. If you'll notice, there have been a couple of other conflicts last year and this year that have very much occupied the media and the landscape, and also the work of the International Criminal Court. So I do have my concerns about where the Rohingya investigation is at, and I really hope that it is not going to be a forgotten investigation, because there are still 1 million refugees languishing in Bangladesh who cannot go home because there is no accountability for those perpetrators who are in charge in Myanmar. Well, hopefully actually not for much longer. It's looking a little bit promising. But that's the situation there. So that's how the International Criminal Court is relevant to one of those case studies at the moment. Now, I also want to talk about, I talked about Article 9 in the Convention, which says that any dispute under the Genocide Convention has to be brought up in the International Court of Justice. So I want to talk about the International Court of Justice. And this is where I want to end as I go through on a positive note. How am I doing for time, Adam?
Well, just under 1 hour. Yeah. You got 15 minutes.
Oh, great, perfect. Okay. So as I mentioned, the International Court of Justice is not about individual criminal accountability like the courts I've just talked about. It's about adjudicating disputes between states. So I want to talk you through a few cases that have come through the International Court of Justice using the Genocide Convention related to the case studies that I've just talked about, and also one extra case that's going on at the moment that's very interesting. So there were 2 cases brought before it related to what happened in the former Yugoslavia, and the first one is Bosnia and Serbia. So the date that I have there, that's the date of the judgment. When you see an International Court of Justice case, if it has a date, that means there's been a judgment, and that's the date of the judgment. So in this case, there were some important developments in how the court looked at the convention and what the obligations were or are under the convention. So one of the things they put it out, if you think back to, remember Article 1, and it says that states are obligated to prevent and punish genocide. And what they discussed in this case was the fact that actually the convention doesn't obligate states not to commit genocide. Those words are not in the convention. And so this was one of Serbia's arguments, hey, we're not prohibited from committing genocide. I mean, I know, right? Yeah, it's crazy. So the court gave that short shrift. And this was quite important, even though it sounds quite obvious, legally it's really important to make these statements about the interpretation of it. And that's why courts are so important. So what they said was, well, given the purpose of the convention, the effect of that Article 1, this obligation to prevent and punish, is to prohibit the commission of genocide. It makes no sense if you're obligated to prevent and punish genocide, but you're allowed to commit genocide. That's a legal absurdity. So, but it was just good that the court did that from a legal perspective and to clarify that definition and what obligations are under the Genocide Convention. What else? Something else that was important that came out of this, and of course, I will add that there are many things that come out of all of these cases, but I'm not going into everything, but just pulling out some of the important things that came out. Was that they talked about, when does this obligation to prevent genocide come in? Like, when is a state obligated to prevent genocide? And so what they said was this prevention obligation kicks in at the existence of a serious risk of genocide. So they're saying there's no point in waiting till it's happening for your obligation to prevent it to kick in. That, again, this makes no sense. So it's merely in the case of a serious risk of genocide, and then you are already obligated to take steps to prevent it. I will add, they also said the actions don't have to succeed because, I mean, that would be a very high bar. But at least your obligation is to take the actions that you can as a state to seek to prevent genocide. So they have to have this reasonable suspicion and a serious risk of genocide, and then they're obligated to act. There was also another case brought. Now, I should add that in the Bosnia and Serbia case, they found that Serbia had committed genocide in the case of Srebrenica. There was another case, which was Croatia v. Serbia, and that decision didn't come down until 2015. This was a bit more problematic in a couple of ways. So the first one is, if you think back to that list of crimes, one of the crimes is committing serious bodily or mental harm. The court decided that the commission of serious bodily or mental harm must contribute to physical or biological destruction of the group. And I mean, I'm going to keep using the word absurd because sometimes these things are absurd. This requirement is not found in the Genocide Convention. It's also not found in the International Criminal Court statute. They have added on this extra requirement. This has been significantly criticised, and as with the other items that I put up here that I'll tell you about, by lawyers, because adding in an additional requirement that doesn't exist in the law makes it much harder to prove and to convict for that, or to hold a state accountable for this particular crime. And you can also think, if you're talking about the fact that they've separated out crimes, they've got the crime of killing already, so they've put a separate crime of committing serious bodily or mental harm there for a reason. It's a different crime, so it shouldn't have to contribute to the physical or biological destruction of the group. You know, you shouldn't be connecting those. So this is legally really, really problematic. And I really hope in future cases that the court is going to make changes to the findings from this particular case. The International Court of Justice's rulings are only binding on the states to the party of that case, so we're really hoping that they change it. They also said, so remember again, one of the other crimes was imposing measures intended to prevent births. They said that those must actually affect the capacity of the group to procreate. But that's not what the crime says. It says imposing the measures. It doesn't say actually causing prevention of procreation. So again, they have added an extra requirement there that's going to make it more difficult going forward if that is to be used. This is a really problematic case. The third really problematic thing that they found was that genocide, and they said, must be the only inference that could reasonably be drawn. So they were also saying that in the Bosnia-Serbia case. And this is really problematic. If you think about crimes, there are crimes that have many different many different goals, for example. Breaking and entering, that's two things. They would be kind of saying, well, the only inference is that you're entering. It doesn't make sense that they've added this. No one has ever heard of this in law before, that this is the only inference that can be drawn from someone's behavior. So it's really strange and it's really problematic. So basically what they're saying is you can only have genocide. Like, you couldn't have war crimes and genocide, for example, because then the inference is that you're also committing war crimes. So therefore there's two inferences. It's really terrible legal reasoning. So I just want to finish up by some positive. What I think is positive is the use of the Genocide Convention at the moment, currently, in the International Court of Justice. So coming back to the Rohingya, we have the case at the moment, the little West African country of the Gambia brought proceedings before Myanmar, before the International Court of Justice. So they are underway. And in 2020, the court ordered what we call provisional measures. So these are just, it's an order of something before they come to the judgment stage, the merit stage. They say, okay, we're going to give an order that holds the status quo or tells somebody not to do something. So basically, they ordered that Myanmar has to prevent genocide and ensure that their military does not commit genocide. They also have to submit regular reports to the ICJ, which apparently they have been doing, but those haven't been made public, which those of us working in the field find highly problematic because we don't know what's in those reports and whether they're truthful or not. What is really interesting out of this case, so obviously you're thinking, hey, what, the Gambia? You know, they've got nothing to do with the Rohingya, they're not even a neighbour, they're not affected by this. But what the court said was that because of the nature of the Genocide Convention, this is so important that any state that is a party to it can bring a case against any other state that's a party to it. So they're saying it's basically the common interest of all countries who are a party to it to bring a case. So that's really important. And so they were saying, yes, Gambia can bring this case. At the moment, we've passed what's called preliminary objections, which is basically where the other country says, oh, the court doesn't have jurisdiction, but the ICJ said, yes, we do. So that's where we're at now. So, you know, you can keep an eye on the news to see where that goes in the future. Just one sec. I'm going to wrap up. I want to finish on one last one, which I know isn't one of the ones I talked about, but it's just the use of the Genocide Convention, and it's really exciting. Excuse me, and really interesting. As soon as the conflict started, as soon as Russia invaded last year, Ukraine brought proceedings against Russia. And it's really interesting because instead of alleging that Russia is committing genocide, what they're doing is saying, so when Russia invaded, one of the justifications that they used was that there was a genocide going on in Ukraine and they're coming in to stop it, that they're fulfilling their international law obligations to prevent genocide. So Ukraine, what they're doing is saying that these are false claims and that they're acting in bad faith under their obligations under the Genocide Convention by making this claim and by invading a country. So they're saying that by doing this, Russia is undermining the entire object and purpose of the Genocide Convention. So it's a really interesting and completely different argument to what we've seen before. So essentially, you can see at the bottom, these are the things that Ukraine has asked the court to do, you know, so they want them to say, no, genocide took place and that, you know, Russia has violated the convention by doing this. And of course, they want assurances of non-repetition and full reparations. It's been really interesting so far. There's not a lot to say about it because not a lot has happened, but this picture, I love this photo when they had the preliminary measures hearing. You can see that empty table. On the right, you can see a table, just a corner with some people at it. That's Ukraine. Their table was full. Russia didn't show up, so their table was empty, which was really interesting. It led to the court giving a preliminary measures order. So similar to the Myanmar one. So essentially, the order was saying that they have to suspend military operations, order their military not to participate in military operations, and refrain from anything that could aggravate the dispute. So I wanted to finish on this because I think it's really positive. It's a really interesting thing, but seeing that states are using this, and to finish by telling you the fact that something unprecedented happened in this case, and that 32 other states have intervened to support Ukraine's case in this. Now, interventions have happened before, but not on this scale. And what this says to me is that there is strong support from states for upholding the Genocide Convention, for upholding the prohibition on genocide, and for upholding their obligations to prevent and punish genocide, even if it didn't take place in their own territory. And so I do finish on a positive note where I hold out hope because of this current use of the Genocide Convention and this really strong and important piece of international law. Thank you.
Yeah, you should say that. How do you turn this on?
Just press. Keep pressing, yeah.
Okay. So, thank you, Melon, for your extraordinary talk. Really, really thick, meaty, and I appreciate the optimism at the end. I mean, it's very easy to turn on the news and not feel so optimistic about both the aftermath of conflicts like this and also the current situation. So I think it was a really encouraging analysis and a very kind of thick analysis of how the legal side of the Genocide Convention looks and is operationalized today. So fantastic talk. Now is the time for some Q&A. We have about 20 minutes. And I would invite anybody in the room who has questions. I will pass the microphone on to you so that folks online can hear you. But if anybody would like to ask a question, did you want to go ahead? Okay, yeah, please put up your hand and I will give you the microphone.
Hi, thank you for that wonderful and very informative presentation. I take it there's absolutely no appeal mechanism or an ability for judicial review of any decisions from the International Court of Justice. So there's all the bad decision about Croatia in 2015, but nobody can do anything about it unless the court itself reverses itself later.
That's a great question. And you're right, there is no appeal because it's such a standalone court and they don't have an appeal mechanism in place. So it's quite unfortunate, but I think the only recourse we have is this concept that the case is only binding on those states in that case. And so there is the opportunity for the court to make a different finding in another case. It's unusual that they would essentially overturn their own decisions, but I think they could still do it and they could make the argument, you know, essentially like many academics have made in their criticism of that case, they could make those arguments and say, you know, this really wasn't the right decision, so we're going to move in a different direction. There are challenges to the International Court of Justice's jurisdiction and particularly the enforcement, which is...
That was going to be my second question.
Yeah.
How do you enforce any judgments?
So that is really the biggest problem. Actually, it's provided for in the statute that the Security Council can enforce the decision. So I do want to say though that someone did a blog post on this recently looking at compliance with just the provisional measures orders, and there's actually quite a good level of compliance. So states do normally comply with the court because the system of public international law is set up because states want to set it up and they agree to it and they create the laws, they create the treaties. So they agree to that and they want to be part of it so that we don't have, you know, essentially chaos in the world. So there is actually a high level of compliance. It's just those kind of stories don't tend to make the news as much. You know, for example, when Australia took Japan to the International Court of Justice for whaling in the Great Southern Ocean, Japan complied with that order. Sometimes it doesn't happen. The United States, for example, doesn't always comply. And we don't actually know what Myanmar is doing because those reports aren't public. And of course, we know that Russia is not complying with those provisional measures ordering it to stop what it's doing. So, of course, there are some situations. And of course, if we're talking about the Security Council as the mechanism of enforcement, that is hardly going to happen, that the Security Council will enforce a ruling against Russia because Russia is a permanent 5 member and will veto any such resolution. So that is a huge challenge, I won't deny it, but I do also want to say that generally compliance is very high.
Hi, thank you for the updates about all the international courts for us. It does gives us hope. My question is there any way to apply what the international courts like ICC is doing to Myanmar to China? What we are learning about is the Uyghur genocide. But what I'm doing is the concealed genocide of the Falun Gong in China. And a lot of Falun Gong practitioners actually are dispersed around the world as refugees. And they had experienced forced labors and all the torture. And there is very clear intention about the killing of this group. So can it be applied to the PRC?
My short answer is no. I don't work on the Falun Gong, but I do work on the Uyghurs somewhat. And yeah, it's a really frustrating situation because, again, it may not surprise you to know that China is not a party to the International Criminal Court. You know, if I gave you a list of the countries that are not, most of them, you would not be surprised. So, you know, it doesn't have jurisdiction. So yeah, that is definitely, it's a real challenge. There isn't, what I do is, my encouragement is for states, is for governments to do something about it, is to enact sanctions, is to enact laws. So I'll give you an example. In Australia, there was an independent senator who introduced legislation that would ban the import of goods that were produced by forced labour, and that was inspired by the forced labour of the Uyghurs. Unfortunately, that lapsed and didn't come into law, and I'm very disappointed about that, and I would like to see such a law brought back in, because I can say that we do have goods in Australia that were made with Uyghur forced labour. For example, the photovoltaic cells in solar panels, and I'm sure you can imagine solar power is quite a big thing in Australia, so it's very difficult to actually find a brand of solar panels that are not made from Uyghur forced labour. Also, security cameras. Like if you want to buy a security camera for your house, there are many brands that are actually used in the surveillance of the Uyghurs. And that surveillance is quite intense, and they have facial recognition so that they can actually recognize the ethnic traits to determine whether someone is Uyghur or not. So it's quite serious surveillance. So if you do want to buy this security camera for your house, I encourage you to do your research and make sure that you buy one that isn't connected with Uyghur forced labour. But those are the types of things. So accountability is a broad brush. It's not just about in a court. I think there are other things that can be done. You know, as I said, things like this, banning the import of forced labour goods or sanctions. And, you know, those are the types of things that I encourage people to write to their MPs about. You know, write to them and say, hey, I think we should bring in a law that bans, I mean, I don't know if you have one here, but, you know, that bans the import of goods made with forced labour. And so those are other ways that we can hold people accountable for this, just not in a court of law.
Thank you for your talk. It was so informative and helpful. I'm wondering if you can speak for a moment about how you navigate and how we as a consuming public should be navigating the use of words like genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity when, first of all, those three things that people don't always understand the difference between, but also when those words are used a lot in the media or on social media, and as listeners and consumers, how to navigate. Just, I'm not sure exactly what I'm asking, but it's just like those words are used a lot. And so how do we know how to interpret what we're hearing and reading about?
No, it's a great question. And I understand, like I do this every day. So I know about it, but most people don't do this every day. And it's complicated. And so it's perfectly understandable that people don't really know what it is. So I can tell you about the three categories. So you've at least got that straight. So we have three categories of international crimes. We have war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And they are not the same thing. They are three different things. So often what you might hear is, you know, oh, the war crime of genocide or something like that. That's conflating two totally different things. They're three different crimes. War crimes are crimes that are violations of the laws of war, we have a body called international humanitarian law, and that's the laws of war. That's laws that regulate the means and methods of armed conflict, so how we fight wars. I think that the international laws that everyone has probably heard of are the Geneva Conventions. If they've heard of anything, that's probably what they've heard of. So those are part of the laws of war. And what they do is they regulate things like weapons, which weapons should be used, how they should be used, and they also regulate who is protected under the laws of war. So that's people like civilians, journalists, medical workers, religious workers, and also there's a whole convention on how prisoners of war are to be treated. So war crimes are violations of the laws of war, and they are committed in the context of an armed conflict. And there's quite a long list, actually, it's a very long list. Crimes against humanity is the next category. They do not have to be committed in the context of war. They can be committed in peacetime. And crimes against humanity is a shorter list of crimes that are committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack on a civilian population. So as an example, if a court finds genocide too difficult to prove, because it's very difficult with that special intent, what they often use is the crime against humanity of persecution. So crimes against humanity often comes into play if genocide is just, maybe they're not sure, or maybe it's too difficult. And then you have genocide as the third category, which we've already discussed. So that's the three distinct categories of international crimes. There's also the crime of aggression, which is not in my area of expertise, but I will tell you that essentially the crime of aggression is the waging of war itself. So that's different from war crimes, which are the crimes committed once war has already started. So they have nothing to do with the legality of the war. If the war, regardless of if it's an unlawful war, those laws apply and war crimes can be committed. So I understand it's really difficult. I will say I really try my best. I do a lot of interviews with media, and so I really appreciate when the media does talk to experts, because I understand that it's complicated and they're trying to get it right. And I think that's really important, because as you've asked, people read these stories and they hear about it and they're unsure how to kind of digest it. Sometimes what's really useful in the media is they might do explainers, and those ones are really useful to read, because what they'll do is they'll usually talk to a few experts in the field and they'll explain things. So like for example, I did one last year, is Putin a war criminal, these kinds of things. So if you see one of those, they'll be really basic and they'll break it down for you, and they're really useful to help with your understanding of that. I do say that it's not a journalist's job to make a finding of, this is war crimes, this is genocide, this is crimes against humanity. It's their job to report on the facts. So they ask experts, what do you think about what's happening? So yeah, look for stories where they've talked to experts and see what the experts have said. That's usually pretty useful. And I will say, if you want to go into depth in this stuff, in international law, there are a lot of blogs. It's a really big thing. So if you're looking for a little bit more in depth, there's international law blogs out there. One's called Opinio Juris, one's called EGIL Talk, EGIL. And they have a lot of material there, particularly, oh my goodness, last year when Ukraine, so I could not keep up. It was just out of this world. So there's a lot of material on those, but bear in mind they're for a legal audience, so they may be a little bit more complicated, but they may help you.
So Shell and then MDOT, and then we'll see if there's time for one more. We'll try one more after that. Go ahead, Shell.
So I actually have a comment. Oh, maybe this is.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay, just a quick comment on the Uyghur thing, because Canada does have a law which bans the importation of goods made from forced labor.
That's great.
Which came into effect about a year ago. And we also have a government body called the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise. And they're currently investigating the use of Uyghur forced labor by a number of companies operating in Canada. I don't remember the full list, but it includes Nike, it includes Gap, it includes Diesel Jeans, it includes Dynasty Gold, it includes Hugo Boss. I may be missing something. Just wanted to say that.
Oh, no, that's great. Thanks. That's really interesting to know. Australian government, take note.
Go ahead, Ed.
Thank you very much for your very informative and very interesting presentation. You used one example of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. In that context, Bangladeshis themselves, it used to be East Pakistanis in 1971, the event that took place, that 1 to 3 million people got killed by Pakistani regime at that time. And we see in the academic and legal domain that all the definitions that you have put together fits into that. Why there is hesitation, and also is it because of the historical past before 2002, before the ICS establishment, or what the main reasons that we don't see at the very forefront to be recognized as a genocide, quote unquote?
I can't really comment on that because I'm not an expert in the area. I'm also not a political science expert, so and certainly not in that region. So I'm sorry, I can't. It'll have nothing to do with the ICC's jurisdiction, but I can say that. But yeah, I'm sorry because it's not in my area of expertise. I don't want to. I don't want to make a guess.
Hi. I'd just like to introduce myself as a woman of the Métis Red River Métis Nation in this place called Canada. I'm just a little surprised, well, I'm not surprised, that in this discussion, we haven't heard any mention by anybody in the room regarding the genocide that's taking place ongoing here in Canada. It was articulated in the report of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And I've heard many talks by Indigenous women lawyers discussing it. So I'm well aware that it's ongoing based on the 5 criteria that you articulated in the beginning. And everybody in this room, as far as my understanding goes, is complicit because it's our taxpayer dollars that are responsible for the ongoing genocide that continues to happen. Canada is not doing anything to prevent it. Like, for example, the statistics I saw in our local paper this week said that the number of Indigenous women entering the prison system is escalating. And I'd just like to be interested to hear your comments on anything you might have to say about that or my interpretation of the whole thing.
So I didn't talk about that because it's not in my area of expertise. There are other people in this room that are far more qualified to talk about that and have written books about this issue than I am. So I certainly do not deem to talk about that when there are people with far more expertise in the room. I'm not from Canada, so obviously I research on other areas I'm not from, but Indigenous genocides is not in my area of expertise. As I said, there are other people here, so that's why I don't talk about it. I do try to stick to talking about what I do know about because I don't want to make comments out of ignorance without knowing it. I obviously have awareness of what happens in Canada. I'm from Australia, so we also have Indigenous genocide, so I am obviously aware of that, but I would not call myself an expert who would come and give a talk on that, and that's why.
This really is a field that we have to be careful about overstepping our expertise in because it's so easy to get things wrong, and their subtleties really matter in all of this. And I just wanted to say that we actually have one of the country's leading experts on Indigenous genocide in the room, my colleague Andrew Wolford, and I strongly recommend that if you're interested in this topic that you read some of his work because it's he's written a lot on it, and he really has a kind of authoritative view of exactly why it's genocide in this country. So I appreciate the question very, very much.
Sorry, did you, because we have one quick, we have about 5 minutes left.
I just wanted to say, your reason for not discussing it is that's just perpetuating the cycle but not being talked about. It needs to be, I would like to hear Canadians yelling and screaming about it, and I hear a lot of silence.
Thank you. Any last question? I'd like to hear maybe from someone who hasn't, yeah. So,
My question is regarding Hamas. The intrusion, the murderous intrusion into Israel is planned and was done with the intent in general to eliminate Israel. I think this constitutes genocide. And the issue is Hamas is not a nation. Hamas is power governing Gaza. Can Hamas be brought to justice or not?
So the crimes that were committed on October the 7th by Hamas are certainly war crimes. They're violations of the laws of war. Under the laws of war, it is unlawful. Hostage taking is unlawful. Sexual violence is unlawful. Killing civilians is unlawful. Use of indiscriminate weapons is unlawful. There have been significant war crimes committed since then by Israel as well. As I said, the killing of civilians is unlawful. The attacking of hospitals is unlawful. The killing of journalists is unlawful. So there is a long list of war crimes on both sides. The situation is being investigated by the International Criminal Court. They were already investigating before this happened. They have been on the ground already, and they are watching what's going on and, obviously calling for both sides to cease what they're doing. So hopefully there will be accountability for perpetrators on both sides of the war crimes that are being committed in that conflict.
And with that, I think we need to draw things to a close. But let me first thank the audience for your questions. I think they helped to really sort of build on what Professor O'Brien was saying. They helped to enlarge and explore some of the dimensions of the argument that she was making. Obviously, the questions of genocide, and there are many, will continue to be asked and will continue to generate answers that will require us to think more and more deeply and more subtly about this particular crime, the crime of crimes, as they say. But I would also especially like to thank Dr. O'Brien for sharing her thoughts and her vision with us and for educating us about this most difficult topic. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.